Right. And I understand there's a requirement. You're not allowed to have boomers on your show.
Yeah, you're the first.
Oh, yeah.
I'm just kidding.
All right, you guys, it is June, which means it is officially Pride Month. Yay! So I know the last few months have looked very different for a number of reasons, and Pride Month, unfortunately, is no exception. And although I know everybody wants to go out and celebrate, wants to go participate in Pride parades, unfortunately, those are not exactly possible in the way that we would like them to be. But that doesn't mean that this is still not a time to celebrate. So in honor of Pride Month, we sat down with Eric Marcus, who about 30 years ago started creating an oral history of the LGBTQ movement called Making Gay History. And so he published the book Making Gay History in the 90s. And now, fast forward to around 2015, in the last 5 years, Eric has been transforming all of those interviews that he had for his book into the Making Gay History podcast. And he's sat down with everyone from Marsha P. Johnson to Ellen DeGeneres, major figures in the movement, and has a very special perspective on the movement and where it's been and now where it's going. So we're gonna let Eric tell you guys a little bit about his perspective on the LGBTQ movement and Pride Month this year.
You know, I was so struck the last couple of days of listening to tons of episodes of your podcast, which I just truly love, by the way. It's so interesting. But I think that's part of the value of it that I immediately saw, is that you have these archival pieces that really give people of my generation a preview into something that seems so far away in history and kind of closed up in a book, but really is still within reach. And you are kind of in the middle of that space for viewers that will end up watching this that have never heard of it. Could you give us sort of a rundown of what it is and your experience over the last few decades working on this?
Sure. Well, Making Gay History, what we are now, is Making Gay History brings LGBTQ history to life through the voices of people who lived it. This project started in 1988 when I was working at CBS News. And it was about that time I discovered that my career at CBS wasn't going to go where I wanted. I asked for this meeting and I said, would you ever put an openly gay person on national news as a correspondent? And there was a lot of back and forth. I couldn't get her to answer. I finally said, look, I just need to know for the future of my career.
Right.
Yes or no? And she said, no, we would never put somebody who was openly gay on national news.
Wow.
So after leaving CBS, Eric went on to create this oral history of the LGBTQ movement, and that enabled him to have conversations that few other people can say that they had, where he spoke with Sylvia Rivera, Vito Russo, like I said, Ellen, Marsha P. Johnson, all of these people. And I think something that was really incredible hearing from Eric, and also that I think he values a lot, is the fact that yes, he got to talk to these people who are now revered, but he also got to talk to a ton of people who people don't necessarily know about. They don't know their story and they don't know their names. And so Eric really feels like that was a privilege for him to be able to listen to their stories, but also to know that those stories were and are so important that he needed to record them and make sure they were safe for people to listen for generations on.
I had a sense of how important it was to preserve these stories, in part because many of the people I interviewed said that they never thought that anyone would remember what their contributions were.
Yeah.
So they entrusted their stories to me. So the celebrity interviews, of which there were very few, were in a way less important because their stories have been recorded. Although hearing Ellen the way she talked in 2001 about her life when she was at a really low moment is not the Ellen we're accustomed to hearing.
Exactly. It was really shocking for me to hear. I was like, even this is just, it's very different.
It was such a fear of mine. I dealt with it in therapy that I really thought that I would be killed for what I was doing, because kids loved my show, you know, and I thought if there's somebody going to an abortion clinic because they don't agree with that, you know, who knows? And we did get a bomb threat that night, and I did get, you know, death threats and all. I thought, it's inevitable. You know, I'm going to, you know, be in danger.
Yeah, and people were very open with me and talked honestly about their experiences and their feelings.
Mm-hmm. Plus, for Eric, now that he's working on the Making Gay History podcast about 30 years after he originally started this work, listening back to these audio recordings is a really profound experience.
Oh, well, listening back to the interviews is really powerful. When we started doing this work, I hadn't heard any of these voices in 30 years. So to hear those voices again was I'd forgotten what it was like to hear the voices because I did a book. These interviews were translated from audio into printed transcripts. I did all my own transcriptions and then edited down into their essence. But it's print, not audio.
If you walk down 42nd Street and even looked like a faggot, you were going to jail.
So you went to jail a few times?
Oh, I went to jail a lot of times. The community is always embarrassed by drag queens.
Why do you think?
Because you got to be who you are. And I refused to pass.
You couldn't have passed?
No, I couldn't pass.
Not in this lifetime?
No, not in this lifetime. I just like being myself.
Right.
It's fun being Sylvia. It's fun playing the game.
So the experience of hearing those stories again was profound, but hearing the responses of my listeners is also profound and moving because people's lives have changed based on the stories they've heard.
Right.
So I hear from young people who decided to go to college because of the stories they've heard. One young woman decided she wouldn't become a nun, that she would go to college.
Wow.
Her story will be in our episode soon, one of our episodes.
So one of the debates that we know you guys feel strongly about is whether or not LGBTQ history ought to be a requirement in public schools. And I asked Eric about this, especially because he has such a rich perspective on this chapter in history, whether or not he agreed. And he said that he's actually already working on making that a reality.
What I've discovered through these trainings, because I'm there to give a presentation of history through my audio, and also help facilitate the discussions, what I've discovered is how complex it is for educators to bring this material into their lessons. So these aren't necessarily discrete lessons about gay history.
Right.
LGBTQ history is a part of American history. For example, Martin Luther King's principal mentor, Bayard Rustin, was an openly gay man at the time. And he was the principal organizer of the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. No one learns about Bayard Rustin because he was out and gay and kept in the background.
Right.
I thoroughly believe that this struggle can be won without brutalization. Our power is in our ability to make things unworkable. The only weapon we have is our bodies, and we need to tuck them in places so wheels don't turn.
His story is heroic. The Red Scare, which we all learn about in school, there was a concurrent Lavender Scare when President Eisenhower signed an executive order in 1953 banning gay people from federal employment, and thousands of people lost their jobs. So I don't see this as a discrete lesson. LGBTQ history is threaded throughout American history as part of the American story. I didn't know there was a history of the gay rights movement, what we now call the LGBTQ movement, before 1969. I thought it began at Stonewall in New York City. So I was shocked and angry once I started doing my research that I didn't know what this history was.
Right.
And if I had known the history, it would have changed my life. The goal is to unerase this history and then provide the resources that are necessary for educators so that they can teach this as part of social studies, as part of science, as part of legal classes. There are so many ways in which, so many entry points to this material. And for college students too, for Psych 101, your introductory class. Dr. Evelyn Hooker, who did the first study comparing gay men to straight men in 1956, and found that gay men were no crazier than straight men. These are great stories that belong in the classroom. And I see that as the cutting edge of the LGBTQ civil rights movement. The movement belongs in the classroom.
So of course, in 2020, Pride Month looks a little bit different than how it's looked in years past. And I wanted to ask Eric about that because Pride Month is essential not only for creating a sense of community and furthering that sense of community, but also for fundraising for LGBTQ organizations. So I wanted to know from Eric, based on his perspective, how coronavirus was going to have a long-term impact on this community and the movement.
I don't think we'll know what the impact is until later. I think what this is doing is forcing people to think differently. I see everything, of course, migrating online, which is very different from being in person. And everyone is being affected differently. I'm affected one way as a grown-up, but I've also heard one of my listeners wrote to say that he was forced to go home from college to where he was out, to a home where he is not respected, and was finding it extremely difficult, and Making Gay History was his refuge, the podcast. So I think everything gets thrown up in the air, and we won't know for a long time how things are affected. This reminds me in a way of the AIDS crisis. When we were in it, we had no idea how it would end, and we didn't know how it would change the world. So here we are 40 years later, and we know how it ended. There was ultimately a treatment. There was never a vaccine. Still isn't a vaccine.
Right.
That, many thousands of people did. It changed circumstances for all kinds of people because their lives were upended, or they died, or they lost a loved one. So we can look back and see how the world changed. We won't know.
Eric also really emphasized the importance of organization on the ground when it comes to the very first Pride marches in 1970, 50 years ago, and how important that is right now in 2020, especially given that a lot of Pride celebrations are going to be happening online with the Global Pride event.
Stonewall was spontaneous. What happened at Stonewall was spontaneous. Nothing that came after was.
Right.
People organized before, they organized after. And that's also one of the lessons of the movement, is that it's the organizers who will inherit the earth. Yeah. It doesn't just happen because there's been a riot or people challenge the police one night. It requires organizing, intensive work. The first Pride March, which happened 50 years ago in June, that came out of extensive planning. The principal organizer of that planned the first public marches in 1965. And that didn't just happen. They had to actually pass a resolution at an Eastern Regional Conference of Homophile Organizations.
Wow.
To plan that march.
How do you see the evolution of Pride marches from 1970 to 2019, and then obviously with 2020 being very different, having this sort of virtual global Pride event?
Yeah.
How do you see that evolution? Where do you see it going another 30 years from now?
Oh, God, I can't even imagine where we go from now. The first march in 1965 at Independence Hall was like a couple of dozen people in Philadelphia. The first march, it was called the Christopher Street Liberation Day March here in New York City on June 28th, 1970. About 2,000 people marched up to Central Park from the Village, and were met by thousands of other people at a gay inn. It was called a gay inn. It was the largest gathering of gay people anywhere in the world from up to that point. And now millions of people all over the world mark the anniversary either in June or other times of the year. And I love the diversity with picnics, with marches, with parades. And there's a difference between a protest march and a parade. Right. And in New York last year, we had both the traditional Pride March and we had a protest march, the Queer Liberation March. I marched in the Queer Liberation March, which was more of a protest march as opposed to a celebratory march. So people get concerned that gay people don't get along, that LGBTQ people argue with each other, and they have 2 marches in New York, or maybe 3, because there's the Dyke March and the Trans March, and it's always been this way. And we're an incredibly diverse community, and my hope is that these marches, these events will continue growing. We see more and more people in places you wouldn't expect to find them, in Tbilisi, in countries where, that's in Georgia, where gay people are under extreme pressure by anti-gay governments. I hope it keeps growing. I don't know where it'll be in 30 years. If I'm around in 30 years, I'll probably be riding in one of those cars or buses near the front of the march for the old folks, sharing stories about the people I met in the late 1980s who grew up and lived through the 1930s and 40s. I hope I'm there. It'd be a lot of fun.
Obviously, Eric has had the immense privilege to be able to have this unique and special perspective on the evolution of the LGBTQ movement since before the 1950s till now. And his hope now that he's been able to save and preserve these stories is that when young people find them, they not only are able to cherish them, but they're able to pay it forward to generations that come after them.
What I hear from young people who listen to these stories is that it gives them a sense, and this is if I had imagined this, it would have been my hope, that it gives them a sense of community. It makes them feel like they have grandparents. that it gives them a sense of pride in who they are, to know that they had ancestors who fought to make things free in the way that they are for this generation, that it makes them feel grounded and inspires them to pick up the ball and carry it forward in whatever way they can, whether it's starting an LGBTQ affinity group at their high school in Eastern Kentucky, or a young engineer here in Manhattan who decided that there was no organization for LGBTQ engineers, not the most gay-friendly profession, and he started an organization. So I hope what they hear from these stories is that it's possible for you to make change. That it's not somebody else who's going to do it, that if someone else isn't doing it, you can do it, and you have a responsibility to the next generation to do that. It's people like us, like you, like me, who can change the world.
So let us know what you guys think. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Let us know if you think LGBTQ history ought to be required in schools. Tell us how you're feeling going into the month of Pride. Do you think Pride, on the one hand, has become too corporate? Are you participating in global Pride? Tell us how you guys are feeling. Thank you guys so much for watching, and let us know what topics you'd like us to cover next. And in the meantime, have a very safe and happy Pride. See you guys later.